the text in the following pages, when the cabinet blocks communication between the nation, and this is a strategically ambiguous term in this text, but when they block communication between the nation and the Sultan, it begins to become necessary for Atatürk to defend the nation at all costs, since the religious leader of the people, the Sultan Caliph, is unable to do so due to the actions of the cabinet. At this stage in the argument then, when we're about halfway through the text, Atatürk also subtly subverts the authority of the Sultan Caliph to his own authority and to the authority of the Grand National Assembly, since they are now the only legitimate defenders of the Turkish nation. With an ever-increasing emphasis on the legitimate authority of the nation in the text, and with this establishment of the Grand National Assembly as this kind of only bureaucratic body which legitimately represents that authority, Atatürk subverts the sovereignty of the Sultan Caliph to the popular sovereignty of the nation. Once Atatürk completes this series of subtle argumentative maneuvers, which comprises over half of the speech, a simple philosophical contradiction, which is born out of contingent historical events, allows him to outwardly reject the continued existence of the caliphate altogether. At this point in the text, Atatürk has traced events through about 1922, when his army has is decisively exercising more power than that of the Sultan. And I'm sure you all are familiar with this history, but let me just run through it very quickly. In 1922, the Sultan abdicates the throne and flees to Malta. The Grand National Assembly then formally separated the religious caliphate from the governmental sultanate and abolished the latter. And then it elected the crown prince, Abdülmecid, as a purely religious caliph, creating kind of a constitutional monarchy for a couple of years. And this idea of an elected caliph, however, constitutes a problem of representation in modern societies. And Atatürk quotes himself in 1922, or he quotes himself from 1922 assembly debates in the speech in recognition of this problem. And I'm going to quote him for a couple of sentences here. He says, "This assembly is the assembly of the Turkish people. Your powers and authority can only extend to the Turkish people and our Turkish country, and can only be effective insofar as the question concerns their lives and their destiny. Our assembly, gentlemen, cannot attribute to themselves powers that comprise the whole of the Islamic world." So here he's introduced a limit between the representational authority of the Grand National Assembly, or just so this kind of limit to that power. According to this idea of popular sovereignty and the nation, the assembly oversteps its own authority in electing a caliph. Since, and I'm going to quote again, he says, "Neither common sense nor reason will ever admit that any individual Muslim state will confer on any man the authority of guiding and administering the affairs of the whole of the Muslim world." Because the representative authority of the Grand National Assembly does not extend beyond the Turkish state, it cannot elect a caliph, since the caliph's power extends beyond the Turkish state. So what I'm trying to show with this example is that a precise set of argumentative distinctions that emphasizes the sovereignty of the nation and the representative authority of the Grand National Assembly allows Atatürk to frame the abolition of the Sultanate, and 2 years later the Caliphate, as resulting from an unplanned yet unmistakable philosophical contradiction. Both of these moves, the abolition of the Caliphate and the abolition of the Sultanate, were controversial and unnerving decisions for even Atatürk's own allies. But the specific construction of the figure of religion in Nutuk allows Atatürk to uniquely mitigate the controversial secular worldview employed in the speech that separates politics from religion, framing it as the consequence of just circumstantial practical reform. As a result, the figure of religion acquires a very specific place in this speech in relation to government, in relation to state institutions, in relation to the figure of Atatürk himself and the nation. And what I want to suggest more broadly is that the way this figure negotiates a number of relations of power and authority within the discourse of the speech is characteristic of the formal operation of figures in the discourse of Turkish nationalism more broadly. If we attend to the speech, as a performance of content, as well as a simple transmission of that content, I think we can get a better idea of the complex operation of the discourse of Turkish nationalism and the way this discourse constructs figures that help organize understandings of national identity. So, as I mentioned at the start, I'm going to kind of end today with a more contemporary example of how this understanding of nationalism and discourse is significant for understanding Turkish politics. Again, I'm going to focus on the figure of religion as it is negotiated in domestic and international institutions. As I'm sure most of you are aware, in 2008, the AK Party was tried in Turkey's constitutional court for alleged anti-secular activities. Came out of the court case without being banned from politics, but with its public financing cut in half. Before the court made its final decision, however, European Union representatives could be heard voicing concern for religious rights, urging the court not to abridge the freedom of religion of the AK Party. Stalwarts of secular government in Turkey heard these EU statements as support for religion and politics, which they argued was a historical threat to democracy and representative government more generally in Turkey. My point with this example is not to take sides with either the secularists or the AK Party, and it's certainly not to suggest that the EU stop making appeals for religious freedom. Rather, I think that this situation evidences how figures are situated within a highly specific set of power relations that comprise national discourse. And so when the EU puts pressure on the figure of religion in a way that might alter this web of relations of authority, domestic public controversy can be one result. By accounting for the ways in which a complex phenomenon like religion is represented in and circulates through the public discourse of Turkey, I think we'll be able to better able to understand the complex interactions of both domestic and international institutions. And of course, one place to start this to develop an idea of how nationalism operates as a discourse is in the allegorical representation of that discourse in Atatürk's Ustun. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for keeping to the time. Next speaker will be Sarah Fischer of American University. Her presentation title is The Politics of Education Policy in Turkey, Secularism and Gender in Turkey's Primary Education System.
Good morning. I too would like to thank Kadir and the SETA Foundation and everyone else who worked to bring this conference together, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here. As Kadir mentioned, my presentation is entitled The Politics of Education Policy in Turkey, Secularism and Gender in Turkey's Primary and Secondary Education Systems. This work is part of a larger project, my dissertation, which examines the relationship between modernism, secularism, and gender in Turkey. I'm going to start today by giving a bit of background about my research and then go into an examination of Turkey's educational system and how it relates to gender. I'll close then with some policy comments on how the policy could be changed. When I started this research in Turkey, I was interviewing a woman, and she told me that in Turkey, when the military used to get ready to go out into battle, they would first send donkeys out on the fields to find the mines. And then she looked at me very seriously and said, within Turkey, in the battle over secularism, women are the donkeys. I found that to be an interesting way to look at secularism and religion within the educational system in Turkey as well. So in this paper, I am examining how Turkey's primary and secondary educational system is set up not just to educate students, but also indoctrinate them with nationalistic gender roles, and how teachers are considered role models, and how, since the founding of the Republic, nationalism, as portrayed and pushed through the Turkish education system, has become a contested issue centered on the changing role of women. Now, to give a bit of background to this, when the Turkish Republic was formed, it was formed after the Ottoman Empire, of course, but the Ottoman Empire had a policy more that centered on cultural pluralism, which was denied when contemporary Turkey was formed. Upon the founding of contemporary Turkey, Atatürk wanted Turkey to be secular, like many of the European countries that seemed more modern, quote unquote, and advanced than Turkey. So in an attempt to show that Turkey was really part of the modern Europe, Kemal instituted rapid reforms, such as adopting the Swiss Civil Code and French Secularism, or YSOT. The government mandated that all children be educated through the 5th grade, and in 1926, Turkey banned the fez, the traditional man's hat, and long beards on men. It replaced the Arabic alphabet with Latin alphabet, and Turkey granted women the right to vote in 1934 as part of these rapidly changing rules and systems. A few years after gaining the right to vote, women were also allowed to stand for national and local elections as candidates. And the goal of all these policies was to establish a great Turkish nation and instill nationalism into each of the nation's citizens. But a major problem at this time was that no one knew what Turkey really was, or as a new nation, what Turkish nationalism really meant. Now, Kohn argued that while most Eastern nations' nationalisms were forming in opposition to the development of Western nations' nationalisms, the West was dominant and influenced these nationalisms of the East. This is not to say strictly that Western and Eastern nations had nationalisms that were strictly bordered on geographic lines. Kohn argues that German nationalism was also an Eastern nationalism because of some of its features. But Eastern nationalisms were in the difficult position of creating their new identities over established cultures, not necessarily nations or nation state, but established cultures, while simultaneously comparing the state's identity to that of Western states. So Turkey, for instance, had to create the ideal image of a Turk over the image of the Ottoman Empire, which had existed for centuries, while it was also being heavily influenced by Western nationalisms and Europe particularly. Nationalism, explains Kadir, was faced with the, quote, choice between imitation of the West and identity. This is also true in Turkey, and Turkish nationalism was a top-down enterprise, largely centered on education. Jordas and Orbis outline the education's role in nationalism by stating, quote, a nation is an imagined community, imagined through shared memories. All of those memories, beyond the first-hand experiences of the individuals themselves, are shared only because a group has learned to share them, in part through state-sponsored education. So the practices of nationalism were inscribed in the curricula and textbooks of primary and secondary schools in Turkey. Students performed the rituals of secular nationalism daily, and during the interwar period, the Republican People's Party prioritized education, reinforcing the subordination of religious power to secularist authority, and the suppression of sectarian collective identities in the interest of national unification. Then, in the decades between 1950 and 1975, the system of elite public middle schools in Turkey opened. They already complemented an existing set of elite private middle schools. These schools were designed to make a new social class that would provide political, economic, and cultural leadership for the developing nation. Thus, the Anadolu schools along with the science high schools and the teacher training high schools that would follow, were designed to create students who epitomized modern Turkey, a group who simultaneously celebrated local traditions while being westernized, particularly versed in Western technology. Kadir again states, the theme that a patriotic Turk should achieve a balance between the benefits of the West and the East by opting for adopting the science and technology of the former and the spirituality of the latter is repeated quite often in the schooling system. But Westernization and Turkishness are not the only principles of nationalism that schools were tasked with imparting. As part of this, and as part of Turkey's new nationalism, there was this large amount of pride that went into talking about the military. Altine comments, the Ministry of National Defense and the Ministry of National Education have a more symbiotic relationship than most people would imagine. She says, the Ministry of National Defense and the Ministry of Education have been perceived to have a similar mission with different realms of responsibility from the early days of the Turkish Republic. Moreover, these realms are regarded as being closely linked to one another, not only by their virtue of being quote-unquote national, but also because they define each other. Education means defense, and defense is always about education.